America is $36 trillion in the red. China owes $15 trillion. Japan is on the hook for $10 trillion. Germany and the UK each owe $3 trillion, while France owes $3.5 trillion. Every significant nation on this planet is drowning in debt. The grand total for global debt is $317 trillion. $317 trillion. This is 330% of the world's entire GDP. Every dollar of value produced on Earth cannot cover what is owed. We would need to toil for 3 straight years, with zero spending, just to break even. But this reality begs a question nobody seems to ask: if absolutely everyone is a debtor, who is the creditor? Who is holding $317 trillion in assets? If the entire world is saddled with $317 trillion in liabilities, then debt is fundamentally a zero-sum transaction. For every single borrower, there must be a lender. If the United States owes $36 trillion, then some entity owns $36 trillion in claims against the United States. By that same logic, if global debt stands at $317 trillion, then someone, somewhere, owns $317 trillion in global assets. Who? The answer to that question reveals the single greatest wealth hoarding mechanism in the history of mankind. This isn't wealth accumulated by conquest or simple theft. It is extracted through a system where the masses are compelled to borrow and a select few are positioned to lend, where interest compounds infinitely, and where the total debt is mathematically impossible to repay, guaranteeing its perpetual growth while siphoning all real wealth upward. So, let's identify who actually holds that $317 trillion in debt. Let's examine how. The system manufactures new debt without ever creating the money needed to service it. Understand why this is a deliberate architecture, not a series of unfortunate accidents. Which specific groups and individuals reap the rewards of this eternal debt cycle, and why the entire edifice is mathematically guaranteed to collapse, but only after the maximum possible value has been extracted. Grasping this isn't an exercise in economics. It's about recognizing the global financial system for what it is, the primary engine, by which wealth is concentrated into an ever-shrinking number of hands, all while making that process seem organic and unavoidable. Before we can name the holders of this debt, you have to understand the true nature of debt within our modern framework. Most people assume that debt operates like a simple personal loan. You need $10,000, so you borrow it from a bank. That bank possessed the $10,000 and extended it to you. When you finish your payments, the bank has its original $10,000 back, plus its profit from the interest. This is absolutely not how the modern system functions. When a government borrows, by issuing bonds, the capital it receives did not exist prior to the loan. The very act of borrowing is what creates the money. Central banks and commercial banks purchase these government bonds by conjuring money out of thin air via accounting entries. Let's say the U.S. government requires $1 trillion. It creates treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve declares it will absorb 500 billion of these bonds. Commercial banks purchase the remaining 500 billion. Where did the Federal Reserve obtain $500 billion? It doesn't have it. The money is created from nothing. By typing digits into a computer, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expands, showing $500 billion in new assets alongside $500 billion in new liabilities. The commercial banks perform a similar act of creation, using the principles of fractional reserve banking. That money wasn't sitting in a vault. It exists now, purely because the bonds were bought. When the U.S. government borrows $1 trillion, that $1 trillion is manifested through the borrowing itself. But here is the most vital piece of the puzzle. Only the principal amount is created. The interest is never created. If a government borrows $1 trillion at 5% interest, it is obligated to repay that $1 trillion, plus an additional $50 billion in interest every year, but only the $1 trillion was ever brought into existence. That $50 billion to pay, the interest must be sourced from somewhere else. From where? Either from future borrowing or by taxing the existing money supply. This dynamic establishes a perfect mathematical trap. The Sum total of all debt will always be greater than the money supply because interest is demanded on that debt, but was never created, was never brought into existence. This machine demands endless expansion of debt just to pay the interest on the loans already out there. This isn't a flaw in the system, it's the entire point. Now, let's expose who these creditors truly are. The answer breaks down into four main groups: central banks, massive institutional investors, foreign governments, and the ultra-wealthy. The first group, central banks. The Federal Reserve is holding $5 trillion in American government bonds. The Bank of Japan is sitting on $5 trillion of its government's debt. The European Central Bank holds $5 trillion in debt from European nations. China's own People's Bank possesses $3 trillion of their government's debt worldwide. Central banks hold a staggering $25 trillion in sovereign bonds. While this represents only 8% of the $317 trillion total, it's the bedrock of the entire structure. Central banks conjure money from thin air to purchase these bonds, which lets governments spend far more than what they collect in taxes. But the real question is, who owns these central banks? The Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It is a private entity owned by its member banks. The 12 regional Fed banks give shares to their commercial bank members. Giants like J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo collect a guaranteed 6% annual dividend from their shares in the Federal Reserve. When the Fed holds $5 trillion in government bonds and collects interest on them, that profit is ultimately funneled back to the private banks that are its owners. The general public has been led to believe the Federal Reserve is a government body. It is not. It is a private banking syndicate, engineered in 1913 for the express purpose of letting private banks profit from the nation's debt. The Bank of England, established in 1694, was openly designed as a private corporation to finance the government. The Crown needed cash to fund a war against France. So, Parliament authorized the Bank of England's creation as a for-profit enterprise. The bank loaned $1.2 million to the state, and what it got in return was the sole power to print the nation's money from day one. The purpose of central banks has been to enrich private financiers through the creation of public debt. The ownership schemes have become more convoluted over time, but the fundamental operation remains unchanged. Central banks generate new money, loan it to the state by buying bonds, and then collect the interest, paid for by the citizens. The second group, institutional investors. This category covers pension funds, insurance corporations, mutual funds, and sovereign wealth funds. Together, these entities hold an immense $120 trillion of the world's debt. Pension funds account for $50 trillion. Insurance companies have $35 trillion. Mutual funds control $25 trillion. Sovereign wealth funds command $10 trillion. But who is behind these institutions? Pension funds are, on paper, owned by the very workers whose retirements they are supposed to secure. But those workers exercise absolutely no control. The fund managers are in charge, and these managers get paid based on the total assets they oversee. Insurance companies are the property of their shareholders. Corporations like MetLife, Prudential, and AIG are all publicly listed, but their stock ownership is incredibly concentrated. The wealthiest 10% of all households own 89% of all stocks and bonds. In effect, these insurance behemoths are owned by the rich. Then you have mutual funds like Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, which oversee $20 trillion in assets. While Vanguard claims to be owned by its fund investors, the real control is held by its management. BlackRock and State Street are publicly traded companies, but their ownership is likewise consolidated among affluent shareholders. The consistent story you find with every institutional investor is that control is concentrated within a tiny managerial elite, while the ultimate financial rewards are funneled overwhelmingly to the affluent. The third class of creditors, foreign nations. Other countries hold around $30 trillion in debt issued by their counterparts. For instance, China possesses $3.2 trillion in overseas assets. $850 billion of which is in United States Treasury bonds. Japan possesses $1.1 trillion in American treasuries. So why do nations hold the debt of other countries? The answer lies in the global trade system. When China exports $500 billion more to America than it imports, China is left holding 500 billion dollars. It then uses those dollars to purchase Treasury bonds. While the arrangement benefits both nations in the immediate future, America gets cheap goods and China underwrites those sales by loaning the money right back. It engineers a profound long-term dependency. But inside China, who is actually profiting from holding trillions in foreign bonds, it isn't the average Chinese worker. The bonds are held by the Chinese government, which is directed by the elite of the Communist Party. The fourth category, ultra-wealthy individuals and their family offices. Globally, the top 1% controls roughly $40 trillion in financial instruments. With a massive share held in bonds, the top 0.1% controls $20 trillion. The top 0.01%, a cohort of about 500,000 families worldwide, controls $10 trillion. These dynasties, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Waltons, the Mars family, the Koch family, and the Saudi royal family all command immense bond portfolios. When you possess $10 billion in capital, you invest in government bonds and corporate bonds, assets engineered to pay you interest with minimal risk. A single family with $10 billion in bonds yielding 4% collects $400 million a year in passive income. They do not work. They produce nothing of value. They simply gather $400 million annually from the interest paid by the debtor class. This is the central mechanism for concentrating wealth through debt. The affluent lend to the rest of the world and perpetually collect the interest. That interest is funded through taxation, through corporate profits siphoned away from workers, and through endless mortgage payments. Wealth is systematically drained from the many to the few via the architecture of the debt system. Now, let's aggregate these four categories. Central banks command $25 trillion. Institutional investors control $120 trillion. Foreign powers hold $30 trillion. The super rich possess $40 trillion. That amounts to $215 trillion of the total $317 trillion. The outstanding $12 trillion is held by smaller scale institutional players, corporate treasuries, and middle class, savers who have bond funds in their 401ks, among other entities. But even this fraction is disproportionately in the hands of the wealthy because that is where all wealth is concentrated. The bottom 50% of the human race owns practically zero financial assets. They only own debt. They are burdened by mortgages, student loans, credit cards, and car payments. They are the borrowers, the top 10%. Meanwhile, owns the majority of financial assets. They are the lenders. So, the answer to who the creditor is the wealthy, operating through the central banks they influence, the institutions they own, and their own direct investments. The debt system is an engine designed to transfer wealth from the poor and middle class who must borrow to the rich who are positioned to lend. Allow me to illustrate how this very machine has functioned throughout the ages. Consider medieval Europe from 1200 to 1500 A. D. The Catholic Church served as the primary financial lender. Monarchs took on loans from the church to pay for their wars. By the year 1500, the Catholic Church had come to own 25% of all the land in Europe, acquired primarily through foreclosures on unpaid debts. In Florence, during the 1400s, the Medici family became the most powerful house in Europe, a status built on the back of lending. They lent money to kings, popes, merchants. The income from interest dwarfed the profits from any actual enterprise. By 1450, the Medici family was so powerful they were kingmakers, installing popes and manipulating monarchs. The founding of the Bank of England in 1694 was the codification of this debt as wealth system. King William III required $1.2 million for a war, So, Parliament sanctioned a private bank which would loan the money directly to the state. In return, the bank would collect interest funded by the taxpayers. And, critically, it was granted the sole right to print the nation's currency. This became the blueprint. First, you establish a private corporation with a monopoly on money creation, granted by the government. Second, that corporation lends money to the government. Third, the taxpayers are forced to pay interest to that private corporation. The result is that the institution's owners become fantastically wealthy from a perpetual stream of interest payments. During the 1800s, the Rothschild family perfected this very system. Mayer Amschel Rothschild had 5 sons, and he dispatched them to Europe's 5 financial capitals: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. Each one of them set up a banking house. Soon, the family was lending to nearly every government in Europe. Following the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, the Rothschilds controlled more government debt than any family in history. As Nathan Rothschild famously declared from London, "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." By 1850, the Rothschild dynasty held an estimated 50% of all European government bonds. They were collecting tribute from every major power on the continent. The fortune they built from lending alone surpassed the wealth of entire countries. In early 20th century, America, J.P. Morgan executed the exact same model. He extended loans to governments, railroad empires, and industrial giants. By 1912, Morgan's network of banks held 25% of all financial assets in the United States. The pattern over 800 years is identical. Those who create and lend money become rich. Those who borrow money become enslaved. The lenders amass fortunes from interest payments without ever producing a single thing. Meanwhile, the borrowers perform all the labor and create all the value. Yet their debt only grows larger. This system is engineered to make sure that the total debt can never be repaid. The mathematical trap is brilliantly simple. When money is created as debt, only the principal amount is brought into existence, not the interest required to pay it back. This guarantees there is always more debt than money. If the entire money supply is 100 trillion, but the total debt, including interest, is 120 trillion, it is a mathematical impossibility for everyone to pay off their debts. The only way to manage the existing debt is by creating even more new debt. You borrow more money just to cover the interest on the old loans. This inflates the total debt, which in turn demands even more, borrowing to service it. The debt is designed to grow exponentially. This is the reason global debt has exploded from $40 trillion in 1990 to 317 trillion in 2025. That's a 7.9 times increase in 35 years. The total debt doubles roughly every 10 years. And it has to keep expanding, because if the creation of new debt ever stops, there's no money left to pay the interest on the place, existing debt, and the entire financial structure implodes. The architects of this system knew this from the very beginning. The founders of the Bank of England in 1694 understood that once the government borrowed their $1.2 million, it could never be fully repaid, as the interest owed would always exceed the amount of money in circulation. This is not a flaw, it is the defining feature. Perpetual debt creates perpetual interest payments, and perpetual interest payments create a perpetual transfer of wealth from the people who work to the people who lend. Now, I will show you precisely who benefits from this machine in the modern era. In 2024, with global debt at $317 trillion, the annual interest payments alone amount to a staggering $15 trillion. That is $15 trillion siphoned from the indebted to the lenders every single year for governments. This tribute is funded by taxation. The American government, for example, pays out $900 billion each year on its $36 trillion national debt. Every single dollar of that $900 billion is taken from taxpayers and delivered directly to the holders of its bonds. For corporations, interest is paid by squeezing profits. Globally, corporations are burdened with $90 trillion in debt. To service this, they must find approximately $5 trillion in interest payments annually. And where is that money found? It's found in the margin between what their workers are paid and what their customers are charged. For households, the source of interest payments is their wages. Across the world, households owe $60 trillion, requiring around $3 trillion in interest payments every year. Consider a family making $70,000 a year. If they pay $15,000 in mortgage, interest, and another $5,000 on other loans, nearly 29% of their earnings go straight to creditors. So, this $15 trillion annual river of interest flows from the pockets of taxpayers, workers, and families, streaming upward into the coffers of central banks, institutional investors, foreign powers, and the ultra-wealthy. The top 1% of the world's population alone captures an estimated 40% of that $15 trillion in yearly interest. That's $6 trillion annually diverted to just 80 million people. Narrow it further, the top 0.1% grabs 20%, which amounts to $3 trillion for a mere 8 million individuals. At the absolute apex, the top 0.01%, just 800,000 people, collects 10%, or $1.5 trillion. Think about that. 800,000 individuals receive $1.5 trillion in annual interest, drawn from a system where 8 billion people are either debtors or the taxpayers footing the bill. This translates to $1.975 million per person for the top 0.01%. From interest income alone, this is not a flaw. This is the wealth concentration machine by design. Debt is the conveyor belt that moves wealth from billions of people to millions, then to thousands, and finally to a handful of families at the very pinnacle. And this concentration is accelerating because interest income is designed to compound. When you collect $10 million in interest, you use that money to acquire more bonds, which in turn generate even more interest, which you then use to acquire yet more bonds. Wealth compounds exponentially for the creditors, while debtors are permanently trapped on a treadmill of repayment. In 1850, the Rothschild family reportedly controlled $2 billion in assets. Adjust for inflation and run that through 175 years of compound interest, and the family's fortune is now estimated between $500 billion and $1 trillion. They weren't building industries. They were lending money and harvesting interest across 7 generations. This is the blueprint for virtually every dynasty of old money. The original fortune may have come from enterprise, but its perpetuity is secured through lending. They own the debt. They collect the interest. They reinvest the proceeds. The system is constructed to guarantee their wealth grows indefinitely, as long as the debt machine keeps running. And the machine must keep running, because the moment it stops, the entire edifice implodes. Governments require debt to operate. Corporations require debt to expand. Households require debt to afford homes, cars, and an education. Our whole modern economic reality is founded upon debt. And debt, by definition, demands creditors. The creditors are the wealthy. And the wealthy use this inescapable debt paradigm to systematically extract wealth from everyone else through interest payments that are never meant to cease because the principal itself can never be cleared. But this system has a mathematical breaking point. The debt cannot expand to infinity. Global debt is already 330% of global GDP. While debt expands at 7% per year, GDP is only growing at 3%. By 2035, if these trajectories hold, total global debt will surpass 400% of GDP. At that level, the interest payments alone would devour 40% of the world's entire economic output. That is a mathematical certainty of collapse. The endgame is inevitable, and one of 3 things must happen. Governments can default, which annihilates bondholders and implodes the financial system. Or governments can inflate the currency, which is a covert transfer of wealth that vaporizes savings. Or governments can declare to a debt jubilee, wiping the slate clean but fundamentally re-engineering society. All 3 paths lead to the destruction of middle-class wealth while insulating the elite. For a simple reason, the elite own hard assets, are diversified across multiple currencies, and have their holdings spread globally. The middle class, in contrast, is trapped with debt, a single local currency, and assets that are not diversified. This is a feature, not a bug. The system was engineered to concentrate wealth during periods of growth and periods of crisis. In an expansion, the wealthy are the ones collecting the interest from a world of perpetual debt. In a collapse, they are the ones with the capital to purchase assets at rock-bottom prices from those going bankrupt. We saw this playbook during the Great Depression, as banks foreclosed on farms. Wealthy financiers swooped in to buy them. Independent farmers were reduced to tenant farmers. We saw it again in 2008 when waves of homeowners defaulted. BlackRock, Invitation Homes, and other private equity funds bought up hundreds of thousands of houses at discounts of 50%. The rate of homeownership fell as corporate landlords took over. This exact scenario will play out in the next crisis. When the debt-based system finally shatters, the middle class, buried in obligations, will default. The asset-holding elite will then acquire those defaulted assets for pennies on the dollar. This $317 trillion debt apparatus is not a pending crisis. It is a functioning extraction machine, meticulously designed to channel wealth from the many to the few, in good times and in bad. And there is no opting out, because the mechanism is global, all-encompassing, and inescapable. The interest you pay on your mortgage goes to a bank owned by shareholders who are overwhelmingly wealthy. The taxes you pay are used to service government debt, which is held by bondholders who are, again, overwhelmingly wealthy. Every single transaction in the economy contains a hidden interest payment that flows to the top. The typical American pays $20,000 every year in direct and indirect interest across a working life. That amounts to $1.4 million in payments streaming from you to creditors who are, on average, 100 times richer than you are. This is the blueprint: create money as debt, charge interest on it, and collect forever. Funnel the world's wealth into the hands of creditors. And crucially, ensure the principal can never be extinguished. So the flow of interest is eternal. The $317 trillion paradox has a solution. The creditor is a tiny global elite who operates through the central banks they command, the financial institutions they own, and the vast direct holdings they personally manage. They are the creditors to literally everyone else. The interest payments flowing from 8 billion people to a few million at the very top represents the single largest transfer of wealth in all of human history. And it happens silently, every day, buried inside every purchase you make. But even the final collapse is designed to enrich the creditor class, because they will simply convert their paper claims into tangible, hard assets amidst the chaos. The system siphons your wealth during the boom and seizes your assets during the bust. So, if everyone is a debtor, who is the creditor? Now, you see, it's the people who architected this entire system to guarantee they would forever be on the lending side, while the rest of the world would forever be borrowers. And that very system, operating with $317 trillion in debt and pulling in $15 trillion annually in interest, is the engine by which our modern global economy moves wealth from the bottom to the very top, perpetually and by design. If this analysis revealed to you who truly holds the $317 trillion in global IOUs and why the entire debt structure is an intentional wealth siphoning machine, then subscribe, because the next video will go even deeper. Let me show you the endgame. What is the mathematical outcome when $317 trillion in debt inevitably becomes $500 trillion? What happens when the interest due surpasses the entire planet's gross domestic product? There are only three possible scenarios: catastrophic default, runaway inflation, or a debt jubilee. And I will expose which outcome the elite are engineering and why. Understand this, all three scenarios are designed mechanisms to transfer wealth from the working class to the very top. The $37 trillion question is a settled matter. The $500 trillion question is what comes after the collapse. And the answer to that will determine whether you safeguard your wealth or have everything you own stripped away. When this debt-based system is finally brought to its knees,